I'm writing a thesis, PhD thesis on Philip K. Dick and Aldous Huxley, and as a result, drugs are a big concern of mine in my own literary kind of interest. So it's a literary English literature thesis, so perhaps not as hard science as my former speaker, as the former speaker. But anyway, I'll get straight to it because I've got a lot to get through, and it's slightly more kind of, for want of a better expression, technical, but not science technical, more literary technical and so forth than the previous one, and possibly quite a lot longer. So I'll try and get through it as quickly as I can. So basically the title's illustrating what I'm going to be dealing with today. Okay, so, and sometimes the slides are going to vary to what I'm saying. It's not going to be, so you might have to do a little bit of multitasking. Might keep you entertained. So anyway, I'll start by just, posing the question, PKD, a drug-addled nut. PKD's reputation as a drug-addled nut, as it has been put by one of his biographers, is no subtle characterization of Dick as a writer who was often under the influence of drugs. Nor is it the standard characterization of Dick, whose fictional narratives in unfamiliar worlds seem enough in and of themselves to occupy and to satisfy the limits of a reader's imagination. Surely, we might ask, Dick's own personal habits are less illuminating than the work itself. But no doubt this description of Dick, the drug-addled nut, somewhat playfully by Lawrence Sutin, I should say, is contingent on the thematics of Dick's fictionalizing philosophy. That is, the highly imaginative, ironic, ludic, humorous, and conscientious, very churned out, nature of his novels, as well as on the warped, distorted, multidimensional spaces in which they unfold, and the frenzied, albeit appropriate, pace at which they progress. This description is also, secondly, almost certainly based on a number of misconceptions about Dick, who, while certainly at times a heavy drug user, did not ultimately think about drugs in a positive light, I think, or I would contend. In about 1971, Dick had disavowed the belief that using illicit drugs could be of a properly kind of beneficial, physical, mental benefit, and conceded their damaging effects in the author's note in A Scanner Darkly, where he dedicated the text to, the fallen children, as he called them. In a way that is resonant with William James, however, who, in the 1900s described St. Paul's rod to Damascus vision simply as, well, criticized those who describe them as simply discharging lesions of the occipital cortex, he being an epileptic, that is St. Paul. Dick similarly begins to see, sometimes cynically and sometimes very seriously and prescriptively, the problematic zone of the effects of chemical alteration, psychochemical alteration. Ironically, it is in this context that Dick begins to reify and problematize his implicit belief in psychochemical determinism, as I can contend, the extremes of which characterize almost all of his post-1971 novels in some way or other. So, why should we examine Dick's drug use? I'm not going to do everything that I do in my thesis or in my research today, obviously, but I'm just going to go through a few things. Dick's drug use and drug philosophy was of a specific type, I would say. He does not gel with the camp of psychedelic advocates, Timothy Leary, Ken Casey, and so forth, but rather he sits in a stranger and more singular place. He's the philosophical realist and the critic, and yet he's the right-hand man of the psychiatric diagnostician. Similarly, we should probably be careful not to ascribe Dick's speculative and fictional imagination simply to his use of drugs, obviously, or the lines of flight he ensues thereby or therewith. Dick's fascination with and ambivalent view of technology, as the speaker before me glossed, is redolent throughout his novels, but it also applies to drugs. And while this is an observation we can read into Dick, it is also a lesson Dick's novels teaches us. Similar but different to Huxley and Brave New World, Dick's novels demonstrate the endgame of psychochemical and psychopolitical population control, albeit in a parodic, ludic, warped and amusing way. Okay, so Avita Ronald has eloquently put into words this strong link between electronic culture, or technology, and drug culture. These two are compatible and coextensive in Dick's fiction, precisely because Dick writes about pharmaceuticals and drugs synesthetically. That is, like technologies, they affect and alter the senses and can be put to specific uses for specific wishes and so forth. And I'll talk about synesthesia in a little bit more. While very much imperfect, drugs like CAN-D and Choose-E from 3 Stigmata of Palmer-Eldritch, and they're linked with other technologies, with, for example, the Perky-Pat layouts, if we can call them technologies, for instance, connects them with spatial and temporal experiences in a way that really we see for the first time in Dick in terms of science fiction, I think. Dick's drug use and the lessons that his use of drugs bestowed on him and his writing should not altogether be dismissed in considering the scope of his ideas and the nature of their presentation in his fiction, and this is why I look at it. Indeed, not only should the effects of drugs Dick used, we've got methadone, later the hallucinogens, speed, and even so-called heroic doses of vitamin C, not only should these be accounted for in terms of their influence on Dick's understanding of space and time and his mental activity, it is worth spending time also considering the way in which drugs are described in Dick's novels, i.e. the way they're mobilized and discussed and imagined. While I will only offer a very cursory sketch of my research today, the way in which I've been going about examining Dick's drug use in my own project is as follows. So it's loosely structured by these two methods. I look at a number of aspects of Dick's novels where psychosis and drugs are the subject, how he treats them, and then I offer a brief reading of some of the remarks Dick has made in interviews about drugs, the more candid admissions and opinions he has of drugs. And then in each, guided by this kind of method, I focus on 3 related ideas. The link between drugs, technology, and literary production, writing. The connections between both classical psychotomimetic, psychosis mimicking drugs, as they used to be called in the 50s, and amphetamines with psychosis, and visual perception and phantasms. And thirdly, the link between temporality and drugs their kind of synecdoche, or another word for psychiatry specifically. So, maybe today I'm interested in conveying one aspect of Dick's fiction and drugs that I find particularly interesting in light of the scientific, that is, the psychiatric research on schizophrenia and visual and oral psychotic episodes, and their link with mechanical, technical, or technological ontologies. To begin, we can quite simply note the presence in Dick's fiction, and especially in the 3 Stigmata, of visions of mechanical prostheses that are somehow augured or indicative of a drug-induced vision or experience. So, one takes Choose-E and sees Palmer-Eldritch's 3 Stigmata in others around them. Thus, Leo Bolero, toward the end of the 3 Stigmata, can feel uneasy and yet just confident enough to express that while he is seeing the 3 Stigmata, the robotic hand, the dead artificial eyes, and the steel teeth and jaw in those around him, while he can say these are just the effects of Choose-E, rather than a permanent psychotic state in which he will henceforth experience the world. We, of course, and I think Dick is suggesting, that we should not be so sure. He teaches us that we simply cannot know what is real and what is not. What is a psychotic hallucination? What is simply a faithful or a shared perceptual experience? For Dick, this anxiety and paranoia about whether what one sees is a hallucination or not stems from a paranoia about hallucinogens, among other things, and psychotomimetic drugs, but more globally from his, and we were talking about epistemology before, epistemological position and his role as, paradoxically, the diagnostic fantasist, as I will kind of sketch or contend today. The very impossibility of diagnosing mental disorder, and we've talked about the impossibility of other things in the sciences today, is at the core of Dick's view of the human and its reduction to a set of symptoms, epiphenomena, physical exams, statistical manuals, methods, and so forth. And yet, amid all of what might be construed or interpreted as a critical psychiatric position, he's critical and yet interested in psychiatry, Dick is, this may be seen as in the parodic vein of his ever-present sardonic and underlying critique of capitalist markets, qua the big pharmaceutical regimes, and of the black market nature of illicit drug deals and its strange similarities with licit drug deals and the pharmacy, and with trade deals in general. These features of Dick's work are ultimately, as Christopher Palmer has suggested, indicate an interest of Dick in humans as primarily self-interested, deceitful, malevolent, and an interest or preoccupation in people doing things just to get their own fix. And I think he traces this in characters throughout his novels and short stories. So, amid these variously critical aspects of Dick's relationship with drugs, it is then perhaps somewhat surprising to note the extent to which Dick's literary characterizations of disillusion, delusion, mental illness and psychosis parallel those that have, in the last decade and a half, begun to actually emerge in the philosophy of psychiatry and psychiatric philosophy. Hence, we have the philosopher of psychiatry, Alfred Krauss, noting the technical nature of some hallucinal or schizophrenic experiences. And here I won't go through it, but the quote basically is suggesting that there are technical experiences which are somehow related to our experience of the world after technology that have kind of made their way into our kind of the emergence of psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia and so forth. And this is, of course, not a particularly new idea, although Dick is, I think, very kind of narratologically original in bringing it to our attention. Of course, Deleuze and Guattari and other philosophers from the 70s and 80s had also suggested that schizophrenia and mental disorder and so forth could have, in effect, been brought into a different state by our technological world and so forth. So a few other examples here. Psychosis and psychosis-like visions and states have been linked to technology elsewhere. ICU psychosis, I'm not sure if anyone's heard of that. That's where someone's on the operating table in the intensive care unit and they have quite disturbing hallucinations about the doctors taking over their body, and it's kind of similar to almost an alien kind of probing delusion or something like that. Avita Ronald, I mentioned her before, she's got a great book where she links schizophrenia and particularly oral hallucinations to the invention of the telephone. These kind of, the way in which we could hear things that are occurring could not have quite so easily been turned into a psychotic episode until it actually happened with the technology of the telephone. That's Ronald's argument. And of course, roughly her argument, Boone, I don't want to quote Ronald in that summary, Marcus Boone, who's written a great book called The Road of Excess on writers and drugs, talks about how with the use of laughing gas, what is humorous and what's most humorous about using laughing gas is that what is revealed is the mechanical nature of humans. And of course, this is very familiar to those who've read the Three Stigmata, although I'm not sure if Dick is there laughing as if he were on laughing gas, so much as being quite disturbed that Palmer Eldritch, the mechanical man, is appearing everywhere in his friends and himself, obviously. Okay, so is Dick always on drugs? I mean, this is an interesting question because when you read the interview transcripts, he offered a typically twisted or conditional dualistic characterization of his writing. It falls, he claimed, into 2 degrees: writing done under the influence of drugs and writing done when not under the influence of drugs. Of course, there's always a caveat. In the latter case, where he did not take drugs, he would then write about drugs, kind of as a Freudian sublimation, one might say. Here, Dick offers a sense in which drugs, however, are ineluctably tethered to his writerly mode. Offering no explanation for his impetus to write about drugs, Dick instead places his habit into a circular logic of his own economic need and the insubstantial market demand, that is, the logic of the deal. He took amphetamines, he says, to write so much as he did, and he wrote so much as he did because the pay rates were so low. It is also perhaps instructive that Dick uses the word degrees here, and we talked about temperature earlier, to explain the distinction between these 2 kinds of writing, in that it is itself a technical or scientific word, one might say, gesturing at both temperature, i.e. he's hot and bothered when he's writing, and the arc or the angle of the works, which is kind of, when we think of mathematical degrees. Just a kind of very literary observation of Dick's language there. By 1971, following Dick's evaluation and brief institutionalization at the Hoover Pavilion Hospital at Stanford, he decided that he no longer needed amphetamines. However, unlike his 1977 remarks in which he attributes the decision to give up stimulants to his becoming financially comfortable, no longer needing them, Dick, in this earlier interview in 71, this was in 76 I think actually, basically explained it by saying that the drugs didn't work. As Dick notes, they said when he visited after recalling his time at Hoover Pavilion, he said that the doctors said, "They said I was taking it for a placebo effect of some kind. They couldn't find out how blood tests showed that the amphetamines never reached my brain. They were baffled for the reason I was taking them, so I stopped taking them." Therefore, in 1971, Dick, kind of gives up amphetamines because he believes the diagnosis that he's been given, that they actually, his liver was detoxifying them. They weren't crossing the blood-brain barrier, and they weren't affecting him at all. So, while the seriousness of the procedure of having a physical exam and blood test may well have been enough on its own to spur Dick to decide to kick the speed, his comments reflect an attitude to the baffled physician which seems to represent his own interest in treating himself or experimenting with himself diagnostically. Dick, of course, interpreted the doctors to be right in that after he stopped taking them, he worked, in his words, in exactly the same way. He said, "I work at breakneck speed," this is post-amphetamines, and then I just crash for days. I literally sleep for days afterward, and then I go through the entire cycle and give all the evidence of having been wired all the time I was writing, and then crash afterward. And yet there's no amphetamines involved whatsoever. And this book I just sold to Bantam, I wrote in 12 days. So this is typical, this is actually not that typical, but it's a candid interview moment where Dick's saying, "Hey, I kicked the speed, but I'm exactly the same. I'm writing things really quickly, I'm churning it out. This is so, in conformity with the diagnosis from the doctors." And here I'm thinking Dick's kind of, this is a pivotal moment for Dick, and he's starting to kind of become more interested in diagnosis and psychotic kind of medicine and that sort of thing, or psychiatric medicine, I should say. So Dick's developing belief that a drug could possibly be ineffectual as a physical substance, that it might be all in the mind, that it might be misread or misrecognized by the user, that it could be experienced as a placebo, was quite probably a significant influence on his writing at about that time of the Three Stigmata of Palmer-Eldritch, which, as his first book dealing explicitly with a kind of hallucinogen, I think, toys with this idea that the drug's effects will be largely determined by what is done while its influence, it takes its effect on the user. And here we're talking in terms of Leary's set and setting and that kind of the contingency of the environment and the user's mental position while taking the drug determines the outcome and the effects. While, as Dick affirms, he never wrote anything under the influence of psychedelics and had not even seen psychedelic drugs at this time, this is not quite true, but I'll get to that in a second. This indicates the real sense in which Dick began to elaborate on his view of drugs as highly politicized cultural artifacts whose branding, as we see comically parodied in the brand names Can-D and Choosy, is possibly very highly determinative, like the market and the branding and all of this kind of schlocky kind of thing in Dick's fiction, but in our real world, very there and very real, patents, intellectual property, how these things are very determinative, perhaps, of the actually experienced psychoactive effects of the compounds. Thus, those who eat candy play with candy, play with the perky Pat doll, and those who choosy are very choosy. So choosy, in fact, that Mayerson, one of the characters, Eldritch's first customer, chooses precisely the one thing that the drug cannot offer, to die. Choosy delivers immortality to the user, but ironically, Mayerson chooses death instead. He doesn't want to exist anymore. He wants to rid himself of the drug and of Palmer-Eldritch's control. In typical forward-looking fashion, of course, Dick, in this 1976 interview, was to attribute his characterization of Can-D and Choosy, what I've just described, not to his 1971 experience or his idea about drugs, but rather to his possibly precognitive abilities. Thus, Dick's hypothetical portrait of hallucinogenic powerlessness in the Three Stigmata is explained not in terms of his self-described new understanding from having stopped amphetamines, but rather the genesis of Eldritch was in fact a pre-visualization of the very real bad trip that was to follow when he took acid for the first time in 1974. This, as he was later to state, was the trip in which he did Now this is a bit of a funny thing, but it counts. He did produce a written work while on hallucinogens. That is, a single page of writing, primarily in Latin, with a small balance of Sanskrit. This is what he says in an interview. I haven't seen it. But in which language, but in typical Dick fashion, he quips in reference to this document that there wasn't much of a market for it, so he had to dismiss it. Again, back to the kind of, I do drugs because I need to get money, and this Sanskrit thing, useless. It doesn't pay me. I'd love to see it. Okay, so yeah, just scan through what drugs. Obviously, you did a few others, but primarily what we know just through the scholarship and so forth. Although I find a lot of the biographies, the Phil Dick biographies, I should get in touch with the authors directly, and this is kind of the start of that, coming to something like this. Because some of them don't really have footnotes or endnotes or references. I don't know where the original documents are. I don't know where the things are. But Marcus Byrne talks about his use of sumoxidrine, which I think was a typical antipsychotic. And then, is that right? And then, sumoxidrine was an amphetamine. And then stelazine was a typical antipsychotic. And then methadone, prescribed methamphetamine, basically. Back when it was totally legal and, in fact, sold very much in the spirit of Mad Men era advertising. Kick obesity, all the rest, do meth. Here's another one, which is really interesting. This is really interesting for Dick because methadone injections will release the story for analysis. So, I mean, Dick's really in tune with the ads. He's releasing these stories for analysis with the meth. I say this with all respect. It's a far more technical thing and interesting, far more fascinating than just a few lines. But anyway, quickly just to go through some of the actual literary text. So the relation between language and amphetamines is certainly not lost on Dick, who, as I conjecture, with the placebo effect and the three stigmata argument I made. He mobilizes what is a common sense diagnostic observation about the effect of these drugs, i.e. they affect language, into a transmogrified and humorous narrative exchange. At one point in a Scanner Darkly, for instance, an exchange imagined by the character Freck as between he and Beres illuminates a number of Dick's thematic preoccupations and spontaneous riffing on the relation between meth, money, the market, manipulation, and paranomasia, which is a literary term for punning, basically, wordplay. As Freck plans the conversation in his head, he will casually suggest to Beres that he has bought a methadone plant, anticipating that Beres will promptly admonish him for wrongfully thinking that the amphetamines are somehow natural and thus grow on trees. The very subtle allusion here to meth that does not grow on trees underlines the fact that neither, as the proverb goes, does money. And the entire imagined sequence has the effect then of reinforcing the dynamic of the capitalist deal, which I've discussed in terms of a subtle play on words, I think. Trickery, the usual schlocky, hackneyed catchiness of a punchline or a tagline, and that its connection with advertising, and how drugs like methamphetamine and so forth always seek to be memorialized by the advertisers to capture the mind of the user or the potential user, and just like the punchline does here, in a joke and in jokes in general. Rather than taking the bait, however, Barris promptly assumes. Here we go. Here's the actual conversation. Barris promptly assumes that the meth plant is in fact a meth lab, precisely what should have been the punchline in the original conversation, and demands superciliously more information from the dithering Freck. Observing Freck's muddledness, Barris quickly compares Freck to Donald Duck, who simultaneously becomes the hyperreal voice of the meth head who's done too much. Of course, it is not so much the tone or sound of Donald Duck's voice as his incomprehensibility as a cartoon who speaks human language that perturbs Barris, we might say. Thus, the language of the excessive meth head must, like Donald Duck's voice, be decoded and translated in ways that are bothersome and yet perhaps sometimes also amusing to others. Like the untenability of the duck who speaks English, the method who's done too much cannot maintain the attention of his audience or his sympathizers for too long, no matter how clever his punchline or the ruse. So there we are. I think that was interesting. I think when we're talking about the Sorcerer's Apprentice, Mickey Mouse came up, and here we have Donald Duck. And if you really want to see Donald Duck as a meth head, there's that one. That's the first. That's the first moment, of course. So I will briefly finish, well, not so briefly, but I'll finish on the point with which I began, where I suggested that Dick's increasing subscription, that is, his adoption in his later writing to a belief in psychochemical determinism, is evident, especially in VALIS, here in Pursuit of VALIS, the kind of not the one that came before the later volume, 900-page exegesis. In a conversation Dick has with himself in the exegesis about psychosis and drugs, one which concludes with him identifying his lost twin sister, Jane, as VALIS, Dick spends a lot of the conversation attributing his episodes of mania and manic depression to a certain chemical toxicity caused by lithium and, as he was later to do, the water-soluble vitamins. And, of course, I invite people to come and talk to me more about these things. I'm sure some know a lot more than I do in relation to these ideas and events. The water-soluble vitamins which he had begun to consume at a later stage, probably from 1975 and or so forth on. And so we see in this conversation here, why then was the onset one in which thought came faster and faster? That is mania. Here he's trying to self-diagnose. He's trying to say, how did these experiences occur to you? It's kind of like this proprioceptive kind of like trying to get out of the self-enclosed system of his mind, talking to himself on tape. It's this experimental idea, and he's using a lot of a diagnostic kind of terminology, and he's trying to really taxonomize his own, psychic and mental position and so forth. And it's really interesting because he's like, not manic depressive. That is so incorrect, and you tend to think that this character is like a physician, giving him the answers and so forth. Why then, that is mania? No, the lithium would have blocked mania. I was lithium toxic, and it's a really interesting thing. And of course, there's some idea about schizophrenia being a double personality, split personality. So all through this, we've got some larger instantiation of some mental, interesting, peculiar mental episode happening. The lithium would have blocked mania. I was lithium toxic. Then it wasn't schizophrenia. It was chemical toxicity, perhaps a combination, plus the orthomolecular water-soluble vitamins. So this kind of, there's more to this interview and other things happen. But, we see instances in Dick's writing of this kind of psychochemical determinism, that it was the drugs that made this happen and made that happen. And I think that's really happening after his first diagnosis or examination in 1971 at Hoover Pavilion, where he really seems to have got on with the doctors, and he felt, given the placebo effect kind of diagnosis, you're perfectly sane, everything's fine, and these drugs aren't actually affecting you, it's all your mind. I think he became fascinated at that time with chemical diagnoses and the relation of psychiatry to reality, in just the same way as he's interested in other aspects of technology and philosophy. I think he's interested in the idea of psychiatry and philosophy as well. So, to conclude, I just wanted to quickly note the ongoing tendency in Dick's writing that that some readers, such as Christopher Palmer, have characterized Dick's writerly mode as diagnostic. So it's not completely my original idea here, as well as theological and psychological. And this, of course, is all prepared within his very, very unique narratives, which are characterized by sensational zaniness and frivolity, what I have called the ludic element. One of the first writers, I think, that really captured the spirit of, the simulacra, not to mention the book, the simulacra, but, the idea of the hyper-real and consumer society and how stupid it is in some ways, and yet we cannot see it because we're so inured. But Dick's foil against the zaniness, of course, of his novels, as Palmer observes, is indeed the larger theological or metaphysical elements of the fiction, as well as, importantly, and what I want to say, his psychiatric and psychoanalytic and diagnostic interest, which reflects a real serious interest, I think, at times. Thus, the episteme, or the knowledge, and we've been talking about epistemology, on which Dick relies to position his implicit claim for the use of drugs as techniques, that is, technologies, as fuel to create fiction and so forth, or fuel for a cash flow if we leave out the middleman, stems from a serious interest and a serious engagement with the psychiatric and mental sciences and the philosophy that one can kind of bring to those sciences, and which of course we see kind of more sincerely expressed, arguably, in some of his essay work, and particularly the prose essay on schizophrenia and the Book of Changes, which I'm not sure if many have read, but yeah, it's interesting to read a non-fictional Dick text as well in this context. So I think I'll wrap it up there because we might be running out of time. I don't want to eat into the lunch. So thank you very much. Yeah.
I'm sure some people have some questions. Please, we've got time.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yes.
I noticed that you didn't make reference to Faith of Our Fathers and Harlan Ellison's collection, Dangerous Visions.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you had any comments about that.
Well, my thesis is I'm writing a PhD project, and it's not only about Dick. So I've selected a few of his texts, primarily those that are kind of most supportive, arguably, of my own interest in kind of this argument I'm sketching in his kind of philosophy of psychiatry position and so forth.
You're familiar with the piece, I assume?
I am not, actually. I mean, I've read a lot of Dick, but I'm scanning so much.
He was asked by Harlan Ellison if possible to write a story under the influence of LSD.
Oh, yes.
He did not actually do. Instead, as he told me, he'd taken, quote, an accidental overdose of tafranol, which was an antidepressant at the time, and for 3 days saw a looming evil face on the horizon.
Yes.
And that informed that entire story. But it was also brilliant because of the twist he put in it, that everyone, the society in that story, everyone was taking phenothiazines in the water supply, antipsychotics, and only when the character stops taking it does he see the true nature of reality, which looks like psychosis.
Yeah.
There's a total inversion between what is the non-psychotic and the psychotic.
Yeah. Which I think, just to leap into that, is somewhat parallel to the idea of this placebo effect, that it was the drug never entered his brain, and yet he felt as though he was on the drug, i.e. it's really when the drug enters the brain that you feel that you're not on the drug, you could say. So I think this question of whether one is drinking kind of antipsychotics in the water supply is affecting us. We're all on a drug somehow or other. It's only by refraining that we can see reality, or vice versa. I think, these are the kind of issues exactly that I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
One more comment, and that's what used to be, at least in 1968, his favorite of his novels was Martian Time Slip.
Yeah.
And there's a famous scene in that where the character sees somebody as turning into a completely mechanical construct.
Yeah. I was thinking of using. There's a lot of different mechanical men, and people in all of the novels. I just focused on Palmer Eldritch because it was so tied to the kind of like hallucination. We could go on. Yeah.
I'm a little disappointed, given your billing, that we didn't get a comparison between Huxley and Dick and the approach to drugs. And also maybe religious experience.
Yeah. Should I take that as a comment or off to one now? Okay, so I mean, it's a really interesting thing because I kind of almost, just out of my own interest and kind of in terms of what I had read, chose Huxley and Dick. I was fans of both of those writers, but it's not until kind of, within the last 2 years after commencing the doctorate that I realised, it's going to be hard to compare these people, these two figures, because they're quite different in many respects. But to attempt to do so, Huxley, I think, perhaps you could tell by the kind of argument I'm trying to make about Dick, that he was interested in psychiatry and interested in diagnosis and this sort of thing, how I'm trying to compare him to Huxley, who was quite explicitly interested in these things. Huxley, of course, was first given mescaline and LSD by Humphrey Osmond, who was kind of the one of the pioneering psychiatrists to try and use LSD psychotherapeutically in Canada, in the Saskatchewan Mental Institution or Mental Hospital. And so Huxley really took it upon himself to research these mind-altering chemicals and to self-experiment in the great tradition of you know, William James and you know, before him many others. But yeah, so I'm trying to, in a funny way, I'm trying to introduce this interest from above or from the outside into the Dick scholarship, and I'm trying to argue that, you know, this should be characterised as a real and kind of illuminating interest in the psychiatric sciences by Dick, and he is in the great tradition experimenting with his own, you know, psychic or mental position, and giving us all of this feedback that we can then, you know, be clued into and benefit or be illuminated by. So, so that's a really rough sketch.
In Palmer Eldridge, there's these two drugs, candy and chew, which you mentioned, and one is reasonably benevolent, and the other one brings on metaphysical horror. And I guess the question is, were these based on any actual drugs or drug experiences?
Dick claims that he'd never even seen psychedelics before writing it. So that's as far as I've gone with investigating. I take his word to the extent, and also the fact that he says I did take psychedelics, but afterwards in '74, that was my first badass trip or whatever.
I'm a psychiatrist,
Okay.
and I've been a reader.
I'm not.
Yeah. I've been a reader and collector of Dick since the '70s, and through our mutual friend Bill here, I had a chance to spend an afternoon with Phil back in 1980, and you know, knowing what I know based on my day job for the last 30-odd years, I think one of the difficulties in interpreting a lot of older philosophy or research is we didn't know as much about the science and the phenomenology of the expression of symptoms of psychiatric disease, even in the 70s that we do now. And I'll be the last person to say that we've got all the answers now.
Yeah.
But actually, I was talking with Bill earlier about how back in 1984 or 5 at the WesterCon, there was a Dick panel with Tessa Dick and Dick Lupoff, and I asked about, because based on my reading of everything, I've read all the critical stuff, all the interviews, you know, I didn't know that stuff when I met Phil, but having read it all since, I think pretty much beyond any shadow of a doubt from my perspective, that he did have bipolar disorder. And because of the nature of that disease and what we know now about the effects of different medications of all sorts, including blood pressure medications, I think what you can see very clearly is his cycling over time. And so what I asked Tessa, and it's what you were mentioning that he had said about the whole lithium thing, is, oh, lithium didn't work. Well, that doesn't mean that you don't have that disease. It just means that that's not an efficacious medication for you. And that's true with everything.
Yeah.
You know, blood pressure medication, whatever, not everything works for everybody. And on the other hand, there's lithium toxicity, which may cause a delirium, but not knowing exactly what his symptoms are. I mean, more often what you see is like lots of diarrhea, and you can get really unsteady on your feet and very confused. But again, I don't want to belabor this and, you know, keep other people from
I think
questioning
you're
things, but it's
very
just
important
that
point.
we know very different things about how these diseases react over time than we did then. And actually, back in the 1970s, it was very uncommon in the US for people who we now know truly had bipolar disorder to be diagnosed as bipolar. Back then, it was much more common in England, if you were bipolar, to have the accurate diagnosis. In the US, most folks would be diagnosed as schizophrenic, because in the moment, at a point in time, somebody who has schizophrenia and somebody who's manically psychotic can look indistinguishable. And the way we diagnose these conditions is by the pattern of symptoms over time, not at a point in time. So again, that's just some background, a slightly different view of this stuff, given what we know about the phenomenology of these disorders in human beings around the world. You know, people had auditory hallucinations long before telephones.
sure.
You know, it's that sort of thing.
Yeah,
People can put
absolutely.
out those theories, but it's like
Yeah.
thousands of years ago, people were hearing voices. So,
Absolutely.
anyway.
Really brought into relief a really important kind of interface that's occurring in the humanities and sciences, and especially in this area of psychiatry and say the arts or literature or expressions of a mental place, a spirituality and so forth, and their relation. It's a particularly fraught area. For precisely these reasons, it's almost impossible ever.
Well, I think what's always unfortunate is people think, because I've mentioned this to folks in the past, they go, oh my God, you know, you're invalidating his art. And it's like, no, they're not mutually exclusive at all.
Well, I see
So I've always had a problem with
I see
people
my
saying
work as a
it must be
provocation to this
visionary.
kind of
Yeah.
debate.
Yeah.
I think the sciences, especially the psychiatric sciences and the arts, can find a way to communicate in a more kind of productive and interesting way for both disciplines. But obviously my position as a literary scholar is relies more on kind of the kind of literary theoretical and philosophical paradigms that have kind of emerged around kind of medicine in general. So if we think of like Foucault's Birth of the Clinic, or Michel Foucault, for those who are, and discourses of power and things like that, I'm sketching out in broader terms, and the specifics will, you know, I want it to be as specific as possible, but you can only fit so much in anything. You know, in broader terms, this idea, and particularly Dick's ideas of the institution of psychiatry and this sort of thing, and it's going to be a time capsule in a sense. It's always going to be Dick's view of it as opposed to our view looking back on Dick.
And the cultural role of psychiatry in the 1950s Americas is very
That's
strong.
right, yeah.
Let alone in the Bay Area where he was. I mean, there's always been a strong psychological, psychiatric culture in the Bay Area.
Yeah,
So it's like that's what he grew up in, so that's what he knew.
Cultural.
Phil was obsessed at certain points with the thought that he might be schizophrenic. He was self-diagnosed. He was obsessed with Ludwig Binswanger's work on the case of Ellen West and so forth, and the Dasein and existential psychoanalysis of that period. But he told me he was seeing at one point a psychiatrist, a classical Viennese trained psychiatrist with a German accent, who said, "Oh no, Mr. Dick, you are not schizophrenic. You are much worse. You are obsessive compulsive. You think you have schizophrenia. You know, we can treat schizophrenia. We cannot treat obsessive compulsive."
And I think this is exactly the kind of things that led him to form his view that, you know, conflicting opinions and this sort of thing. He inevitably felt perhaps like there was some power play going on in which he was a subject to all of these opinions and views, and he really was interested in kind of empowering his own view, I think, of himself, which is what we see in these kind of things.
Yeah, you're talking about sort of technology being expressed during, you know, psychosis and drugs which mimic psychosis. And you were kind of talking about losing guitar, saying that, you know, technology kind of had this potential effect on, you know, how the psychosis was being expressed. Am I right in sort of taking that as saying that, you know, you're saying that technology is, I think, for readers, psychotomimetic? Is that right?
Yep, psychotomimetic. They used to just, you know, in the clinical literature of the 50s, like Humphrey Osmond's papers, for example, they would describe hallucinogens as psychotomimetic. And Humphrey Osmond
is technology, are you saying that like technology has that effect, as in like it, you know, technology by itself
induces psychosis? I wouldn't characterize technology.
Or has those sorts of effects, not the inducing effect, but maybe gives you sort of effects outside of the use of drugs.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's a yes or no question, but you know, one wants to say no in a way. But I think this question is something that we can read into Dick, or at least comes out of Dick's fiction, isn't it? I mean, technology does induce some kind of psychic position, whether it's psychotic or you know, it influences our mentation and this is kind of goes back to what was happening in the earlier in the earlier talk, that it can be used for good and bad. It's a pharmacon. That's, you know, the description that's often used in terms of drugs. A pharmacon, it's to cure or kill. I think technology can be characterized similarly as something that has this dual dynamic, something that can be good or bad. And in that sense, when it's bad, it can create these kinds of disturbances, but not, you know, not speaking as a psychiatrist, but more as a philosophical position. You know? I mean, I think it was in Plato's Phaedrus that the invention of writing itself as a technology was regarded as something that would rot our minds because we would have writing there rather than our memories to lead us to knowledge. And therefore the memory would become this non-entity and deteriorate and so forth. So I think this is kind of more the tenor of my position. It's kind of a more philosophical approach in this tradition of cultural studies and that sort of thing. I wouldn't quite go so far as to say this is the correlation between technology and
No, I used to think you're basically arguing in one direction. I was wondering if you believe that there was any sort of...
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a good question. Yes.
One more, Chris.
Yeah, one more. Okay, I'll go with the one I was going to... Sorry, everyone.
Have you looked much into the evidence of Dick's marijuana use in 1974? There's a really great Claudia Bush letter where he writes, Dear Claudia, the other day my friend left a joint which I smoked, and I shouldn't have smoked it because I had a vision of Jesus, and then I called up Tessa and said my unconscious is available, ask me any questions. She asked him, what is VALIS? It's a beautiful letter, right?
Wow, I haven't read that. Yeah.
Okay.
Please, yeah.
Just a little bit more than there's a lot. A close read of the exegesis will provide you a lot of very interesting material about his own reflections and even some of the holographs that are.
I'm still working on a non-close read in a way. so yeah, no, definitely. And this is why I'm here. I'm making my way through it. But the cannabis I've not really opened up in terms of my discussion of Dick on drugs yet. So thank you for that suggestion. Yeah. Okay, thanks for everyone's attention.